If your anxiety has changed recently, or maybe your existing anxiety feels more intense, more vivid, this might not be what you think. A lot of women assume their symptoms are getting worse because life is just getting too much. Maybe they're getting worse at coping. But there's a link between anxiety and perimenopause, and they can feel almost identical. If you misread that, you can end up managing the wrong problem, trying things that don't work, while your symptoms build in the background. In this video, I'll break down how perimenopause affects anxiety and how to tell the difference between the two in a clear, evidence-based way. So you can understand what's driving your symptoms, make better decisions about your health, and most importantly, stop second-guessing yourself. As always, I will put timestamps below if you want to jump around the video. Now, let's get to it. When anxiety gets worse in midlife, it's easy to assume that the answer is simply to push through, to work on your mindset. But sometimes the thing you're trying to fix isn't the main driver of the symptoms. When symptoms are intense, most people default to the explanation of the usual drivers: stress, burnout, overthinking, lack of coping skills, and that keeps you focused on mindset tools. Mindset tools might help to some extent, but focusing on them alone can mean that you miss the real driver that's building in the background, which makes the whole experience more confusing and harder to trust. And once that happens, it's not just frustrating, it also leaves you second guessing yourself and trying things that don't match your problem, and it might actually just add to your mental load of trying to deal with this, while in the background you have fluctuating hormones and hormone-driven anxiety. If you mistake hormone-driven anxiety for a coping problem and try to fix your mindset, then your symptoms go completely unaddressed. So then the question becomes, if this isn't just stress tolerance getting worse and life getting too much, what is actually going on? The first thing to understand is that perimenopause is not just a slow decline in hormones as many people think. It's actually more about instability, and that changes how anxiety shows up. A lot of women will hear, oh, your hormones are low, and they picture a slow, predictable decline. But in reality, it's inconsistency. It's some days are very good and manageable, some days are flat, some days you feel completely wired, and other days you're an emotional wreck. And it's the unpredictability and the erraticness of the symptoms, I think, that often make it so much more difficult for us to deal with. The clue, however, is in the instability. The instability matters more than a simple deficiency story, because that fits in more with perimenopause. It's a phase of constant hormone fluctuation, and that directly affects how your brain regulates anxiety. This matters even more if you've never thought of yourself as an anxious person, because people who have never, or women who have never experienced anxiety previously, are the ones who are most at risk of developing anxiety in this phase of life. There's a reason why that can feel so unsettling, because you might not notice it as anxiety. For some women, the change feels new, suddenly, and completely out of character, which makes it really hard to recognize. Instead of thinking, this feels like anxiety, they think, why am I suddenly reacting this way? And when there's no obvious personal pattern to compare it to, then it's really easy to assume that it's something wrong with your coping, rather than considering that this might be related to hormones. The biggest increase in anxiety risk, as I said, during perimenopause shows up in women who weren't previously anxious, and that makes it sometimes difficult to tease out. This hormonal shift also helps to explain why this version of anxiety can feel so different from the kind people expect. It often feels more physical, more reactive, and harder to reason your way out of. Instead of just showing up as overthinking or worrying, it can hit as a racing heart, chest tightness, your body feeling like it's on a sense of higher alert. And these physical symptoms make the symptoms feel more dramatic and more convincing, and particularly when nothing in particular has triggered them. It becomes hard to tell where stress ends and the body-based symptoms begin. And sometimes your body is racing and your mind is trying to catch up. This makes a traditional way of managing anxiety more tricky, because it might not work as better as usual. In actual fact, the changes in hormone levels actually change the brain chemistry and the pathways that the brain uses to react to stress and triggers for anxiety. It can make it feel more physical and reactive and harder to control than something you've experienced before, if you have experienced anxiety before. And just to make things even more confusing, there's often a lot of overlap between perimenopause symptoms of anxiety symptoms. So how are we supposed to tell the difference when the overlap can be so strong? Poor sleep can leave you feeling wired, emotional, and less resilient, whether the original driver was anxiety, hormones, or both. The physical symptoms, racing heart, sweating, restlessness, the tension, that's textbook anxiety, but it can also have a hormonal component. So the symptoms themselves don't always give us the answer, particularly if you only rely on one symptom in isolation. Sometimes we don't want to oversimplify things, and we have to realize that things are coming from multiple directions at once. So if the symptoms don't give us a clear answer of what's going on, what do we pay attention to instead? One of the most useful clues is not just how bad the anxiety is or what symptoms you're having, but the pattern of whether it's changed. A lot of women focus mostly on intensity, thinking it's worse than before and I'm not coping as well as before. But sometimes the most revealing question is, how is it showing up differently from before? Maybe it's more cyclical, maybe it's more unpredictable, maybe it's more disconnected from the kind of triggers that used to make sense. Maybe it now appears in waves, or you notice there are stretches where your nervous system feels unusually sensitive for no obvious reason. These patterns matter sometimes more because they suggest something broader is influencing your anxiety or the anxiety. Not just your circumstances or your coping mechanisms or the other things that are going on in your life. If the anxiety has changed in pattern, it's becoming more unpredictable, cyclical, disconnected from clear triggers, that's often a sign that hormones are involved. The second clue is to zoom out and look at what else is happening besides the anxiety. Is it arriving on its own, or is it showing up as part of a wider cluster of changes? Because if you've never had anxiety before and it's appearing at the same time as disrupted sleep, maybe changing periods, although that's often a late sign of perimenopause and going into menopause, but night sweats, brain fog, a different tolerance level for stress, then that wider context matters. It also stops you treating every symptom as a separate mystery. Looking at symptoms in context gives you a much clearer picture than analysing anxiety on its own. And it also stops you from treating every symptom as a separate mystery, when they may all be linked to the same underlying condition. For someone who's already overloaded, that can be the difference between feeling lost in symptoms and starting to make sense of them. So essentially the second clue is when you have anxiety alongside other symptoms, which could be driven by hormones and not just psychological drivers and psychological stress, that's more of a clue that this is a perimenopause, menopause type of anxiety. So once we've decided whether this is traditional anxiety or whether this is something that is driven by the hormonal fluctuations of perimenopause, the next question, and perhaps the most important one, is what do we do with this information? And the answer is usually not to pick one lane, but perhaps to stop forcing a false choice between the two. Because if you treat this only as a mindset issue, you can miss the biological factors keeping the symptoms active. And if you treat this only as a hormone issue, you miss the anxiety patterns, behaviors, and stress that will make your symptoms worse. If this video resonated with you, just know that you're not alone. If you feel that you need to discuss any more of your medical symptoms or the possibility of starting HRT or another medication for anxiety, I encourage you to discuss this with your GP or your medical provider. If you would like to see more evidence-based and practical real-life guidance for this perimenopausal part of life, which may just be the best one yet if you ask me, then subscribe and follow along for more. And I'll see you in the next one.